We hope you and your family are enjoying back to school season. Visit queenslibrary.org to see all of our back to school programs and giveaways, and to read our back to school guide with helpful information about family communication, college readiness, and other topics related to health, happiness, and success during the upcoming school year. Every year, Hispanic Heritage Month celebrates the achievements of Hispanic Americans, the contributions of Hispanic people to our country, and the fact that there is no American culture without Hispanic culture. Join us for our virtual and in-person programs and enjoy our special book lists for all ages. Visit queenslibrary.org to learn more. It's Library Card Sign-Up Month. A Queens Public Library card is your passport to more than 5.5 million books, movies, and other media, over 40,000 classes and events per year, more than 5,000 computer workstations all across Queens, and so much more. Discover everything that's free with a library card. Visit our website or your local library to apply for your QPL card.
Welcome to Queens Public Library's Talk with Manuel Munoz, author of the short story collection, The Consequences. The Atlantic called The Consequences one of the 10 most thought-provoking books of 2022. They wrote, hauntingly simple, in these surprising, vivid stories, worries are deeply felt, but not often spoken aloud. An obligation to kin and the need to survive outweigh much else. The New York Times declared, this collection pushes the reader to appreciate life's small moments of unexpected tenderness with fresh eyes. Oprah Daily stated, gay, straight, American-born, or American dreaming, the characters in this collection exist on the verge of oblivion, but the book outs Steinbeck and its manifestation of the human in places we too rarely dare to look. Writing for The Independent, Sandra Cisneros proclaimed, I envy that I didn't write these stories myself. Manuel Munoz really just did his highest work, his genius highest work, and I'm in admiration. Hi, I'm Brian Alessandro. I have written for Interview Magazine, Newsday, Pank, Huffington Post, Lambda Literary, The Gay and Lesbian Review, and have recently co-edited and co-adapted Edmund White's A Boy's Own Story into a graphic novel for Top Shelf Productions. Additionally, I co-edited Fever Spores, The Queer Reclamation of William S. Burroughs, an anthology of essays and interviews about Burroughs for Rebel Satori Press. I'm also the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the literary journal The New Engagement. My first novel, The Unmentionable Mon, was published in 2015 by Cairn Press. My first feature film, Afghan Hound, was produced by Mary A. Media in 2011. It is currently streaming on Plex, Tubi, and Amazon. My new novel, Performer Non Grata, was released in April by Rebel Satori Press. Culture Connection, curated by Daniel Zaleski and now in its 10th year at the Queens Public Library, is proud to present international artists from emerging talent to award-winning masters. These disciplines include music, theater, author talks, and film. Now expanding into a virtual format, Culture Connection is currently reaching a global audience. Manuel Munoz is the author of 2 previous collections, Zigzagger and The Faith Healer of Olive Street, and a novel, What You See in the Dark. He is the recipient of a Whiting Writers Award, 3 O. Henry Awards, and has appeared in Best American Short Stories. A native of Dinuba, California, he currently lives in one of my favorite cities in the world, Tucson, Arizona, which is where I met him many years ago. Manuel, thank you for joining us. It's great to see you.
Oh, it's great to see you, Brian, and thank you for inviting me, not only in honor of Hispanic Heritage Month, but because this is for Queens Public Library, and the libraries are very important to me. So thank you.
Thank you so much. We're very honored to have you. So most of the stories and the consequences are set in Central Valley near Fresno, California, in the 1980s. You are from Dinuba, as I said a moment ago, which is part of the Central Valley, and you also grew up in the 1980s for the most part. How much did your experiences and observations inform the stories and the consequences?
Oh, quite a bit. In fact, they inform nearly everything I write. I think 3 of the 4 books, the novel, being the exception, which is set in 1960s,
Mhm.
are usually set in the 1980s, which was a formative time for me.
Mhm.
I was not out yet, so
Mhm.
when I go back and reflect on some of the experiences or some of the stories that I knew um, from other people, I kind of see it now through a new lens.
Mhm.
And that's a way in which some of those stories have sort of become reframed or refracted.
Mhm.
Uh, and they keep drawing my attention.
It's a very powerful thing to keep returning to the place of your youth, right? And the place of your formative years, the place that made you essentially. And it's a great gift as a writer to be able to keep revisiting that. How is this iteration of the consequences, the stories and the consequences differed maybe from your previous projects?
Oh, that's a great question because I think this time I'm sort of going a little more outward,
Hmm.
meaning there in previous stories I might have focused or taken inspiration from things that I have experienced myself. This time I was paying a lot more attention to stories I had heard in my own family,
Hmm.
and again, sort of going through that framework of what happens when you turn the tools of fiction onto that. So a couple of them I've called the deportation stories
Hmm.
because they have their roots in the experiences of my parents. My mother is U.S. born.
Hmm.
My stepfather, I call him my father, is Mexicano, and so
Hmm.
their experiences as young people, and I didn't think of them as other than my mother and my father. But
Sure.
looking back on it, I'm thinking, wow, they had some, real responsibilities on their hands, but also some very dire situations whenever he was deported. And
Hmm.
there were stories I didn't hear until much later in my life
Hmm.
that became the basis, I think, for some of these stories you see in the consequences.
So a lot of the characters and the consequences are people who are secondary or tertiary or peripheral in your life. Um, have they had a chance to read the consequences?
Actually, one thing I'm sort of working on is an essay about my mother
Hmm.
reading the book.
Oh wow.
Because
That's great.
my mother never made it past the third grade in
Mhm.
Texas. She was born and raised in Texas, but wasn't able to go past third grade because of the need to work in the fields and help
Yeah.
support her family. Um, and so, and also, we as her children have always helped her um, with translation, phone calls, important documents, letters that came in the mail, things like that. So I was always under the impression that her reading comprehension wasn't great. But when I was coming home from a reading, I don't know, about 4 months ago, and I was in a Texas airport, I think it was San Antonio, and I asked her what she was doing, and she sounded a little sleepy. She said, "Oh, I was reading, and I get a little tired when I'm reading." I said, "Oh, what are you reading?" She said, "Oh, a book that you left behind. It's black and it has some gold feathers on it." I said, "Mom, that's my book.
Yeah.
That's my book. What are you doing reading my book?" I was shocked that she was able to, and I thought maybe what she meant is she's leafing through it.
Mhm.
And she said, "No, I don't know all the words, but I
Mm.
think I know something." I said, "Well, tell me a little bit about what you're reading." And she started to tell me sort of the basic outline of Happiest Girl in the Whole USA,
Yeah. Which is
which
one of the stories. Yeah.
I was
Wow.
wowed. I was
Yeah.
wowed by that.
I love
But
that
she
you're writing this essay about that experience. It's great.
I'm trying because I'm trying to shape it
Mhm.
because it's one, the surprise,
Mhm.
but two, also my incorrect presumption. All this
Mm.
time, and it should be, I think, a lesson to all of us about, we might think of our parents or our siblings as one way, but they change.
Yeah. Yeah.
And over time, as she has, read, something on the TV or the newspaper has come by over the kitchen table, that language has been picked up from her, and she's been able, unbeknownst to me, to read. And
That's
isn't that
It's amazing.
incredible?
It's really beautiful, actually.
Yeah.
Um, in a recent Gay and Lesbian Review interview, you mentioned that you are most focused on class in your writing than much more focused on class than you are on race or sexuality,
Mhm.
which is what many people tend to ask you about, I think, right? A lot of people tend to gravitate towards sexuality, homosexuality, and then race being Latino. There is an intersection too, of course, though, of race and sexuality and class in your work. Can you talk a little bit about how you scrutinize that intersection?
Yeah, I mean, the intersection can be really hard to negotiate
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
sometimes not all of those things are in play. Nor do I create my stories with an eye towards addressing all of those.
Hmm.
The characters are who the characters are. So sometimes, one element is just seems to heighten just based on a particular story. But I say this time that I had a focus on class that was a little more attentive
Hmm.
than before, because I think it was an awareness that people were reading me in a way, and it was kind of a resistance, meaning it is as important to me to think about my characters in terms of class as any of these other ways of identifying them. And I wanted to be sure that people had a way to talk about them, but also in a way that they had to talk about them, read those regarding those conditions. So that's sort of what I've been after.
That's interesting. And obviously, not only did I read The Consequences in your other books, but obviously I also went online and read other interviews with you to prepare for this one. And I came across a Literary Hub essay that you wrote, and I'm going to quote you. I write fiction because I'm often trying to get at the emotional mystery of a glance or an unspoken exchange or a decision made in a moment. Whatever might reside in the unsayable has always seemed most potent to me. I can completely relate to the sentiment. Can you discuss your process of trying to mine the elliptical things, say the unsayable, and without, I might add, ever being too on the nose about it, which is something you're very good at?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, and I've been sort of formulating this answer um, over many interviews, is I think it comes back to being in the closet
Hmm.
and my queer identity, which is understanding the safety of someone who might be like me,
Mhm.
but you can't do it through language initially. At least I'm thinking back into the 1980s and those
Sure,
those.
sure.
And how did I know? How were things coded? How were gestures coded? How were we able to read body language, looks, clothes, gestures? I mean, how do you recognize a come hither when
Yeah, right,
when you're 17 and it's very
right,
dangerous to
right.
follow
Aside
that?
aside from a certain colored hanky in your back pocket,
Exactly.
there's like
Which
there's
which when you're in a rural, when you're away from the
yeah,
big city, it's not even
doesn't
a
exist.
code.
It's not a
So
thing, right?
it has to
Yeah,
be body language or
right.
the trust of knowing. I think that's one of the reasons why
So interesting.
I think about the power of that, and I think about how that actually does translate into really whether it's family or community. Um, when it comes to talking about the very tough things, sometimes characters just don't have the language for it. And
Right,
so their
right.
frustration or their rage or their intense love will come out in other ways. And that's what I feel is my duty as a writer to try to capture.
Yeah, and it's a really difficult thing to do. I mean, as a writer, it's probably the greatest challenge for me is to not over explicate and not be so, sort of veiled that people
Yeah,
completely miss it, right? You have to find
right.
that happy medium. I know also that when I write, I tend to allow a theme to lead. How do you approach a story collection? Did theme or topic dictate the narratives, or did they emerge simultaneously? And also, what are some of the recurring themes in The Consequences?
Oh man, that's a tough question because it presumes that I started the book as a book.
Hmm.
And the mystery of this book was that it didn't. Meaning, I was working on stories, just individual stories, to take the pressure off myself during kind of the decade. It took about 9 years to write the collection, and I was full of a tremendous amount of doubt
Hmm.
about the value of the stories or their accessibility or legibility in the literary world.
Hmm.
And I think it was too much for me to take on to think, okay, I'm writing another book.
Hmm.
I had left my previous publisher and I knew I didn't have a home. And I thought, here I am in a way trying to start over. And I'm trying to start over by writing short stories, which as you might know, or listeners might not know, publishers that's not the first thing that they want. They would
Right.
prefer a novel. They would like
Right.
the big story, and I work in the miniature.
Hmm.
So I wasn't really working on a book. I think what happened midway through, when the confidence struck to say, okay, maybe you are working at a book, is that I kind of looked at the first five and thought about what was happening. And then the last five started coming along that way. And then I started to see, it's like, oh, a lot of these stories involve people moving from one space to another. They involve family dynamics. In one way, nothing had changed. So it didn't feel like I was overthinking, other than, like I said, I'm looking outward. There were fewer stories that
Right.
seemed to hew close to me personally.
So it seems all these threads really did come together organically. And by the way, you could do worse than Grey Wolf Press.
Oh,
They're a terrific publisher, and
they
congratulations for landing
they
there.
they have done a beautiful,
Yeah,
beautiful job. And
yeah.
I think more important than that, and I think it's important to say, um, my editor, his name is Ethan Nazowski.
Mhm.
I thought that when I turned in the draft, it's like, this is done. But he came back, with some edits, and pretty hard edits too.
Mm,
But
mm,
he presented them with such patience and such care,
mm.
and not only that, with the sense that he really respected uh, the characters as if they were real people. I know that sounds a little kooky, but it's important to me that he did that.
Sure. No, I get that, and it's wonderful that you have an editor who is so open and talented and incisive. It's a great relationship a writer can have with the
Yeah.
right editor. So I'd like to kind of go through each one of your stories. I
Okay.
have questions about all of them because they're
Sure.
all so fascinating and distinct. Uh, in the first story of the collection, Anyone Can Do It, the young son Kiki of the protagonist Delphina, who was a young mother, which just is for the audience or for our viewers who have not yet had a chance to read it, whose husband is missing and whose car is stolen, pantomimes, as the New York Times put it, the slow receding of this lifeline. Please talk to us about the young boy's understanding of his family situation in those final moments of the story.
Well, he's not the center of the story, and he's not the center for a reason. He's also a child who doesn't speak.
Mhm.
Back to gesture.
Right?
So what he sees and what he understands is almost impossible to know.
Mm.
But that story, uh, I underestimated the impact that it has on readers. It is the story that a lot of people want to talk about, and that's why it's the opener.
Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't realize how impactful just the first line of the story was.
Yeah.
How I don't want to call it daring. I don't want to sort of pat myself on the back, but it is a very short, basic line. Her immediate concern was money. It's got a very weak verb, but
Yeah.
all of the other words are suggesting something
Yeah.
that really get the story started. And
Yeah.
so I'm pretty proud of that, of the fact that my style had been very spare, but it ended up serving the book in a way that I had not anticipated while I was drawing. Yeah.
I mean, and that's what I think struck me so much too about this story is that while Kiki, the son, is not the center of the story, in the end, those final moments that are so breathtaking, and leave the reader breathless, are kind of his absorption of this situation and nonverbal processing of it.
Yeah.
Really, really potent. And another story, The Happiest Girl in the Whole USA, the narrator Griselda, who was born in the United States, helps a lost young woman from Mexico named Natalia. There's also a recurring refrain, do something with your life, Griselda. Please discuss Griselda. What is she regretting? What is she contemplating? What does this chance encounter with Natalia maybe awaken in her?
I think Griselda's position and remembering that kind of admonition from her teacher, it's a memory, is touches on regret, and regrets that many characters have, where someone in the past has expressed a certain kind of belief in them, but because of circumstances, they weren't able to follow through on that belief. But at the same time, those comments, those kind gestures that others make for us that we don't realize at the time, can haunt us in a good way, because that's precisely what I think is at the center of that story. I hope a reader, when they come across and see what her situation is, that she has in fact done something, and done something with her life by what she does in that story.
It feels, not to sound too new agey because I'm not, but it has this sense of like the power of flow and of like kismet, you know, again, like the right people coming into your life at the right moment for the
Yeah.
right reason that ends up serving you and the other person.
Yeah.
Really, really touching. Your story, Presumido, translates to arrogant or vain and centers on a relationship between a gay couple, Juan and Daryl. This was really fascinating, and I thought you really nailed something really elliptical about gay culture that I think a lot of gay writers are too squeamish to touch. A caterer named Severina tells Juan that Daryl is presumido, which angers Juan and confirms his worst suspicion about him. Juan is modest and not showy, but their friends are, and Daryl seems intent on matching their pretenses and superiority. The story has mystery, it has layers. Please tell us more about the subtext here and what it is that Juan is wrestling with.
Oh, I'm so glad that you had the response to this story, because
Yeah,
when I was putting the collection together, I thought it was one of the weaker ones,
I loved it.
and one that I might like, well, I'll have to turn in something else instead of that one. But when it was on submission, various editors really responded to that one. And I think for the reasons that you talked about, because there's something unusual about what it's asking us to think about. It's class again. It's an aspect of how a couple might relate to each other. I can't quite go back to trace how and why I got fascinated to the point where I felt I needed to write the story. But that sense, and I'm single, but I have felt that sort of that pressure to be of another list when it comes to queer circles. But I felt it was important to try to give it a shot, and I like that it the way that it came out. Also, it was an opportunity because it was so hard to talk about and really put my finger on what it was about. That's precisely why I gave it a Spanish title. That is not easy to translate. There's no one for one word. If you know Spanish, you know what the word really is meaning. It does mean arrogant or presumptuous or of oneself, but it's never exact. Yeah.
Interesting. And that also goes to the mystery of it. I mean, I think it has this great density of otherworldliness that's not supernatural per se, but is so much about sort of existential failure or going off the tracks moralistically on some level that is really deep and troubling. And susto, yes, which means fright, or maybe a deep kind of existential kind of terror. But for indigenous populations in Latin America and the Southwest, it means a kind of soul sickness.
Yeah.
The story is about a man, the foreman, who discovers a dead body in the desert and becomes disturbed by it. This is essentially a story about loneliness and community, and maybe the worry about being forgotten.
Yeah.
Can you say a little more about that?
You kind of said everything.
Sorry.
I mean, I have no. I mean, I love that you picked up on all the things that were so important to me. Yeah. Actually, as we're going through the list, it makes me even prouder of the individual stories, because one of the things that I worry about is that people read one story, they've read them all, when in fact they're quite different, and they have different sources of inspiration. So. And this one came from a dream.
I was going to ask, where did this one come from? It was from a dream.
It's from a dream. I couldn't place the image of a man who's found with a head in the ground, and I went really wild in early drafts, where it's from the point of view while he's in the ground.
Oh my gosh.
He's under now. This is not working. But that's why when you said it becomes a story about loneliness, that came after a lot of meditation, after I was figuring out what the story was doing. And I pulled back and say, well, it's not just that a man's found, there's a haunting. What is he being haunted by? And that, I think, is what developed into it led to a word like susto, which it really is a deep, deep a shaking of the soul.
Shaking of the soul. Yeah. Wow. And the reason is because, another story, Nela
Nella.
Nela is a teenager who gets pregnant and is forced to drop out of high school as a result. Her only hope is to marry the father, or so everyone keeps telling her. Isolation plays a role in this story as well. And please talk about that aspect of it, as well as making difficult choices, because I think a lot of it is also about that.
Yeah, isolation and community. I mean, that takes place in an apartment complex that appears in the previous collection, Las Palmas. And again, just sort of doing an exercise of trying to invent characters or think of characters. I imagined that place in my mind and thought, oh yeah, well, if the story took place over there, who's over there? And thought, oh, it's a teenage girl. Who is she? And just started that way. And that's
So
how I landed.
So the character in the story was invented whole cloth. She wasn't based on anyone that
No,
you would
no.
know. Okay.
Well, I mean, in some ways, there's some there's some family, a bit of a family thread, but not anything like that. Also, there's a very violent moment in it in the story that really comes from newspapers accounts where at least twice in the past 10 years I've seen some kind of account like that,
No.
which may surprise people, but and it might even surprise us to see it in a bit of fiction. But the lengths that some people might go to inflict real harm, not on a child, well, obviously on the child, but to do so through the child to hurt another, a partner or a parent. It's a painful thing to read about, think about.
Yeah,
But
they're
that's
very
how
real.
yeah, that's how
Almost,
together.
it makes me think of Medea, right?
Yeah.
The story of Medea.
Yeah.
So Manuel, would you please read us an excerpt from one of your stories? I think you're going to read from the titular story, The Consequences itself.
Sure. I'll read the beginning of it.
Okay, great.
From the old westerns that his mother loved, Mark remembered one sound in particular, a stagecoach trundling across a landscape, the jostle of the wheels against the hard dirt road of a prairie. Those movies had always made him sleepy as a child, nestling against his mother as she watched her black and white television set, just the two of them in the darkened living room. The sound nearly always woke him because it meant the end of the story. Someone was leaving. Sometimes it was the villain escaping, and sometimes it was a good man who had done one wrong thing. But someone was always leaving. These days, his mother still lived in the same house, but now there was a color set and a small couch for each of them, a glass of sherry in his mother's hand. Mark had his own apartment in central Fresno as a job as a payments clerk for the water department, long lines of people waiting to argue over their bills. He was as bored with his life as his mother was lonely with hers. He would eat an evening meal with her and stay when she wanted company for the old movies. The films were always the same, or rather, they always ended the same way, a rousing orchestra that stirred him awake from his long days. Mark had no clue about what he really wanted and did little except wait for the weekend when he had the energy to end the workday at 5 p.m. on a Friday, then drive the 4 hours from Fresno to Los Angeles. He had lived for the neon intensity of those weekends when the people he met exposed nothing close to unhappiness, and what little money he had saved over a whole month ended up happily spilled on dance floors in the very late hours. This was how he had met Teddy at the beginning of the year. Flushed and sweaty from dance club drinking, he had trailed after him to an Echo Park apartment, a narrow bedroom at the end of a lonely hall. Teddy said the apartment was owned by an older man in his 60s, a man whom Mark never saw, but could hear pacing in the kitchen. The January dawn had broken through the windows, a strong light for winter, but it was the sound of Teddy gasping that had surely woken the old man. Mark had heard the pacing, had registered the old man pausing to listen to them, and had pushed into Teddy with more fervor, harder still when the quiet from the kitchen deepened. He enjoyed causing this kind of hurt, and when they released themselves into sighs and murmurs, Mark had asked Teddy to come away with him. Thank you.
Really gorgeous and heartbreaking story, and I think it's perfect that it is the title of the collection, because it's not only is it among my 2 or 3 favorite of the collection, but also it's the one that I think contains all of these different topics and themes most robustly. It really looks at sexuality and class and race. Am I fair to say that? Is that
Yeah,
right?
I would agree.
Yep.
Yeah.
This story that Manuel just read from, The Consequences, it looks at the relationship between Mark, a water company clerk, and Teddy, a young hustler from Los Angeles who reveals that he is dying of AIDS. Mark kicks Teddy out after learning this. Teddy eventually dies. Mark travels to his hometown in Texas to attend the services. What is going through Mark's head during the final moments of the story? And has he been absolved?
Oh, I want you to answer that question. or it's. I think he wants to be absolved. I mean, the reason why the story was both difficult to write but also necessary to write is that he was so difficult, or complex is what I mean. He recognizes that he's done something wrong by not being willing to give care to someone who needs it. Yeah. Teddy's family has essentially kicked him out, or that's kind of the story we understand. It's a place that he's wanted to flee. So knowingly sending someone back, that's their only option. And then recognizing and having regrets about it. There's that word again. And wanting to do something about it when it's too late. And then doing something that is also just, it's not of his invitation. He does go to the funeral, but essentially he's crashing it. He's been told explicitly by the sister to not come, but he does it anyway. And he's looking for, some absolution, some forgiveness. But who grants that? Who grants?
Right. Who is it to grant? Right? Who has the ability or the power or the privilege to grant it?
And not only that, how when you're very private and you're very reserved and quiet, who are you asking?
Right.
And I think that's the other component to someone like him.
Yeah. So I'm often moved by books or stories. I don't usually cry. I actually cried reading this, which is saying a lot because it's only happened like a handful of times. Movies make me cry very easily, but books, short stories typically don't. So you did something that not a lot of writers have ever been able to do.
Can I add what about the story made you cry? The ending, the middle?
I think it was just there was a tone that you were able to sustain throughout that that again touched me in a really kind of elliptical way. I can't quite put my finger on what it was, but in those final pages, when I guess my fear is to, like, one of my great fears is to hurt someone, right? Is to do the wrong thing, is to do something immoral, and then to feel a kind of regret that I cannot be absolved for. And I felt like Mark, when I asked you if he was absolved, I don't think he was. Yeah. And that stings, like, what do you do with that?
And again, I'm really glad to hear that response, because I've had previous conversations about, is Mark supposed to be likable or not? And to me, the question it's really more, what kind of reaction do you have when someone is seeking forgiveness? If it provokes a sense of empathy for a person who's done great wrong,
sure,
then that to me is a testament to the story, not just my story, but any stories that are capable of doing that for us.
Oh yeah, it's my favorite thing, creating an unlikable character and then making the reader feel something for that character. It's a difficult thing to do, and so if you can pull it off, it feels like a great accomplishment, and you did in this story for sure. And another story, Compromisos, which translates to commitment. There is the story of Maurizio, who has a son and wife, but also a lustful relationship with a man named Pico. In the end, Maurizio watches his teenage son and imagines himself as a young man who could have made different life decisions had he been braver. Please tell us about Maurizio and what he might have missed out on.
Brian, you're hearing all my patterns. I mean, there's that regret again. Who could I have been? And rather than go to the past and stay in the past, it's informed by whatever's going on in a character's present. I mean, that story, which, by the way, a bit of nice news, Compromisos is going to be in the upcoming edition of Best American.
Oh, congratulations! That's
Yeah,
fantastic.
that's coming out in
Nice.
October, so I'm really happy
Great.
about that.
Great.
But this story, it came from a failed date here in Tucson.
Oh, wow.
With a guy who had recently left his family.
Oh, wow.
And he had left his family, and when we were out on a date, he was quite nervous about being seen in public. And around Christmas time, he had expressed to me that, I think my children are too young to know what this means, and I'm thinking of going back. When I was telling that story to some friends of mine, there wasn't a whole lot of understanding or empathy for him. Someone in my group said, that's a great way, to screw up your family, which I thought was a really kind of mean thing to say.
Yeah.
And so that's where it came from. I kept thinking, okay, what kind of circumstances might drive somebody, to consider their lives in such a way, especially because, sometimes when we look at queer stories, some readers are no longer patient with characters either being in the closet or returning to the closet. But again, that is an experience, and that is an experience that is worthy of the dignity of a story.
And your one of your gifts is that you don't ever judge. There's no judgment. It's I mean, I came out at 28, which by today's standards is pretty late. So I kind of get that. And I was chided, when I finally did come out, like, what took you so long? How dare you stay in for so long?
Right.
In Fieldwork, another story, you've come very close to, I think, autofiction. You had previously stated it's the closest to autofiction. It is about your father who had a stroke. Can you talk to us a bit about this story and your dad?
Yeah, that story came about after an experience with my father in 2015. And it also came through a sense of knowing that frustration that people would, no matter what I did, whether I did something in a different style, different length, brevity, whatever, the first step was, we have to read this autobiographically. And I said, I thought to myself, all right, if you're going to, I'm going to give you straight up autobiography. But it wasn't memoir. Quickly, I realized why I turned to fiction. I like to shape. You tell the truth by lying.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it was the story that prompted a lot of editing, both when I was about to submit and then also when my editor at Grey Wolf was looking at it. He kept thinking, he said something interesting. He said, this is a very passive story, given that it's first person. And I said, I think it's okay for a first person story for the main action to be listening and just be listening. Yeah. So that's where that came from.
Well, that's great. In the pink house at the end of the street on the other side of town, which is another story, a group of day laborers reminisce about a love triangle between a foreman, the wife he abuses, and the field worker who was good to her and her children. The story mixes brutality with tenderness, which is another one of my favorite devices, if mixing these two sort of sensibilities or sensations together. How did you vacillate between those two things, between brutality and tenderness? We all possess the capacity for both, of course.
Well, I think it comes from the structure. By that point, I had decided to myself, I'm closing at the end of the book, and I just want to give a different kind of form. And I decided to section the story. I think there are 14 different sections. So every time I went through, each one of them could have their own delivery. And I think that's what made it possible, is that, okay, this is going to be the place where some of the meanness is going to come through, and here's another one where some of the longing will come through. So it might be that it's structural, and that's where it came from.
That's really interesting. And what inspired the story itself?
A bit of family history that I had not realized, and it was told when Prima, a cousin of mine, had a little too much wine, and it was around Christmas time, and the story started coming out, and I had never heard it, and I thought, wow. But again, this story is not that story. There's a bit of it, but it was the surprise of hearing that allowed you to extrapolate something different.
What I love too about this and what you just told me is that the story itself has this quality of like gossip, of like, people pass, like these aren't, it's not first person and it's not even, an observation of a close friend or something. It's almost like hearsay, or we're discussing something we don't have the full story of, right? We're only catching glimpses of this triangle, and we're all like, at the water cooler or the sewing circle, gossiping about it, without having the full story. I like that quality of it.
Yeah,
That's
and I'm glad that you described it that way, because again, it ends with a moment of some older workers on the porch reminiscing. They're playing bingo with the radio and reminiscing. And that's exactly what it is. And again, it points to the origin. I wasn't playing bingo on the porch, but I was at a Christmas table, and hearing a story.
Well, you captured that experience of hearing it. In What Kind of Fool Am I? Another story. A young woman seeks her younger brother who has run away from their Texas home. So much of this story is about small towns not being able to contain big passions or big curiosities. You are from Danuba and you lived in New York, and now you're in Tucson. Can you talk about how your own experience moving from your hometown to other cities, especially one as big as New York, for example, informed this story?
Well, I think when you're either queer or in the closet still, the city looms as in the imagination as the place of liberty and safety. At the same time, or danger, however you decide to imagine what the city's going to be, excitement, basically anything that the town doesn't hold. But the story isn't about that. It's about who gets left behind. It's the sister of a brother who goes off that way, and what's involved with the caretaking. I'm not sure if I want to say anything more about.
I don't want to spoil anything. That's fine.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that you took the point of view of the one who gets left behind. That was very sobering, and unexpected to me. So many of your stories here look at the effects of leaving a place, starting over in another place, assimilation and acculturation, and the worry that maybe a history or a family or a custom or a language or a culture could be lost or betrayed in the process. Are these some of the consequences that you speak of, or that your collection's title refers to?
Yeah, that's again, when I landed on the title, I realized it could apply to so many different things. And it's tied again to regret, or it could be tied to guilt. It could be tied to an action taken or not taken. So it became quite apt. But in terms of those communities, I love the fact that you're describing it in essentially in terms of beginnings and endings. Every single time we ask anybody in any of our communities, where did you come from, or where did your family come from? There's an opportunity there to trace a beginning, or even an end, something that has closed off or is no longer accessible to us, even in our own family history. So the word carried a lot of weight for me, and it's done a lot of really valuable work to help me shape the book.
I'm going to shift a little bit away from the consequences. You currently teach creative writing at the University of Arizona in Tucson, right? What do you see in your students that most encourages you about the future of literature?
Oh, they're so bold. They are so bold. I think what's interesting to me about my students, especially students who come from communities like mine, is they see the challenge of getting published. It's not easy to get published. They certainly see that, but they don't seem as daunted by it as I was. And I think it's because they see models. They see more and more models out there. And it's not just our own community, but various other communities across the national literature. And when they start to see that, there's no longer any strangeness about what they want to do. And it's not just that they're writing stories about our own communities, but they're doing it in their own way, from absurdist takes, to, I've got some real clowns. And they're amazing. They're amazing. Some of them are involved with, sort of transnational histories,
Wow.
They know that their families have important stories to tell about Cuba, Mexico, all sorts of places, and they feel empowered to do that.
Wow,
So I'm
that's
really proud.
exciting.
I'm really proud of them. I'm really
That's
proud of
great.
them.
That's
Yeah.
great. And obviously they're lucky to have you as a teacher to guide them. We will be taking questions shortly for Manuel, so please start sending them in. And while we wait, I have a few more questions of my own. So you've written 3 short story collections and 1 novel, What You See in the Dark. You once told me, I remember when we were in Tucson having drinks a while back, you said that writing a novel was more challenging for you than a short story collection. What makes it harder for you, and would you ever write another one?
I mean, right now I'm saying no, and I think that's well. I mean, it's interesting. I was just talking to a student about this a couple of days ago because they asked me, "What are you writing?" And I said, "Well, I was drafting a story this summer that got too long,
Hmm.
and I'm kind of filled with this terror, like, oh,
Is it going to become a novel?
I don't want to, and I don't want it to be. I don't want it to be. So I said, I'm going to put this away and leave it there and keep meditating on it and make myself distill. I just think that there's something for me that is much more fulfilling about forming a short story and working in miniature and with
Working miniature.
precision. That's
Right.
not to say that novels don't do that. I think novels can do that, but it takes a lot of dedication and patience. And the experience I had with my previous publisher, where they were not supportive of what I wanted to be obsessed with, um, it kind of knocked me down quite a bit, actually, in terms of confidence, and it made me retreat. And so
Hmm.
some of it is fear. I don't want to get myself into a situation where I'm devoting a lot of artistic time only to have someone tell me you shouldn't be writing this. I mean, that's a
Hmm.
hard thing to confront.
Sure.
And someone can still tell you that with a story, clearly,
Sure. Of
but
course.
I don't know. There's something unique about the novel in that way.
What can I ask? What did you want to obsess over or fixate on with What You See in the Dark that your publisher dissuaded you from?
Well, the critique that stuck in my head was, I think, when I turned in the first draft and my editor saw it, his first response to me was, "This is too cerebral,"
Hmm.
and it was. I think it was just about the worst thing you could say to any writer, especially for a writer from my community. I mean, what's wrong with being cerebral? What is
Yeah,
wrong?
it's such a weird criticism. I don't understand
Well,
that.
but it was also, I think, a nod to the kinds of the expectations of writers like me. If it's going to be the immigrant novel, meaning the bootstrap triumphant, and they didn't get that. And when they didn't get that, well, what are they going to do with what I give them?
Hmm.
And I was really hoping that I could sort of make my own way as an artist, as any artist should be, given leeway to do what they do.
Yeah, of course.
But it didn't feel that way. Um,
That's too bad.
but with the novel, it was just, I was really obsessed with that moment of that we all share when we watch a movie and create another narrative. It happens. It just happened to refract through Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. So
Yeah, it's a really fascinating novel. I loved it. I read
thank
it
you.
back in Tucson when I guess I had first met you in 2014. In the same Gay and Lesbian Review interview that I mentioned earlier, you spoke about LGBTQ characters and their stories. You discussed how in the past 20 years, gay culture has changed in terms of how the media or certain big cities understand or accept and even embrace us. However, in many places around the world, or even in the United States, even in big cities, it has not changed all that much in certain circles. How have you addressed these changes in your work since you began writing?
I'm not sure if I've done it directly,
Hmm.
but I think it is a testament to how and why any of us should keep writing.
Hmm.
Because as we build a record of our lives, we make ourselves more legible to more and more people. Um, like the sense that things are always an upward progression is false. I mean, it
Hmm.
can disappear over time. I mean, even now, to think about how our communities are being attacked in
Hmm.
various places, in various states. Even Arizona, in my eyes, has transformed because I lived in New York before I moved here and
Hmm.
felt I didn't feel comfortable.
Hmm.
Whereas it's become bluer, as we
Yeah.
say,
Yeah.
and it's a much more comfortable place, so everything is fluid in that sense. But I think the record, what we do in our terms of our artistic record, stands. So
Interesting. Okay, we have a couple of questions, Manuel. Congratulations on the consequences, Mr. Munoz, and also, yes, winning the Joyce Carol Oates Fiction Prize. I'm sorry I forgot to mention at the top of the hour. Congratulations on that as well. Can you talk a little bit about when you learned that you won this prize and how it made you feel? Did you get to meet Joyce Carol Oates or talk with her on the phone? She had a great interview with Culture Connection about 6 months ago. I interviewed Joyce back in January, and we email once or twice a month now. I'm kind of obsessed with her.
oh, I can see why. I got to talk with her. We had a Zoom in honor of the prize to sort of meet the writer um, back in May. I was floored by the prize because it's for a mid-career novelist, and when they put out the long list of, I think, about 34 writers, I'm thinking, oh, that's just an incredible list of people. So when I made the short list, I thought, well, that's sweet, but there's no way that they'll give it to me. And then this strange phone call comes, say, hey, can we talk to you? I was really taken aback by it. I have to be careful to say, because I told them, I know it's not a California prize, but because it's based in Berkeley, they call it a working prize. And I'm about to go in 2 weeks to do a residency there, and work with youth organizations and a couple bookstores, and then also work at a couple of the schools there. I know I'm going to be in contact with people who know my state, and that's sort of a special. It's just a special perk of the prize to me, of where it's located and who's hosting it, and all of the organizations that came together to put up a prize in her name. And it was a nerve-wracking interview. I couldn't sleep the night before because I cannot believe I'm going to be talking to Joyce Carol Oates.
And she's so sweet and open and accessible, and
yeah. And I have to say, because if anyone goes to the Zoom recording, she is. I mean, she gets great Q&A, and she's a wonderful listener. And more than that, she's genuinely curious.
Yes. Oh yeah. I mean, she's written over 100 books, right? I mean, she has to have a great sense of curiosity, and yeah, she's a really lovely person on top of being, a genius.
Yeah.
But can you make a statement? Congratulations again, though, Manuel. That's fantastic. Can you make a statement about the current rash of book bans in school libraries in the United States? Why do you think these types of bans are happening?
Oh, that's a great question. And my feeling is that, again, this comes to accessibility and legibility. It's because these stories and narratives are a threat. Why? Because they're information. They're information, either, especially for young people. I mean, these stories were not accessible when I was, 15, 17 years old. But especially young adults have more of those kinds of narratives. I actually have one thesis student right now who wanted to read Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe. She says, I know it's a YA novel, but I want to go back and just sort of investigate together, what it means to have somebody sort of discover themselves this way. And I said, sure. But again, that's one of those books where the people who are trying to ban those books recognize that they have impact and they have power, and that's why these movements are abroad. So again, I'm glad that we're doing this with Queens Public Library, that we're listening, or hopefully we're here with supporters of the library and who know how essential libraries are to our communities.
Yes, they are, and thank you for that. What are some of the most memorable books you have read in the past years?
That's a tough one, because that's almost like I want to talk about my favorites. I feel like I'm always repeating this. Joan Silver and Edward P. Jones, because those were the two authors that I kept sort of thumbing through in the past couple of years, because of how they either shape their narratives or they shape community. And they've been important to me that way. I'm also doing right now a very close story by story read along with a student of mine who wants to read Tobias Wolff. And so I suggested, let's read Our Story Begins, which is his selected. He had never encountered much of Tobias Wolff besides Bullet in the Brain. But he's been astounded, and it's been nice to just we're going to go through some of these. We just had to talk about a really phenomenal story called The Liar, which got us talking about how and why we tell stories, but also how and why we try to lie to other people to comfort them. So I would recommend taking a look at that one. Yeah.
That's great. If any of your stories were to be adapted to film, what filmmaker would you like to direct? That's great. Almodovar?
I don't, there, I think any of those directors who sort of work in the indie realm in more of a naturalistic way would be really cool. I mean, some of the nicest things that people said to me is I can see so many of the connections either by characters or people or by place that I can see this as a film. And I thought I appreciate, because it was also for me sort of a sense of I wish I could tell publishers, people might see this as a novel if you repackaged it that way.
Yeah, for sure. That's nice. That's nice to hear.
Yeah.
The book is The Consequences by Manuel Munoz. Manuel, thank you so much for doing this. It's really been a pleasure. And thank you everyone for watching, and have a great weekend. Stay safe.
I appreciate it. Thank you.